All right. Well, hello everyone, and welcome back. I have a very interesting guest here with me today. As many of you know, I have a big interest in Egyptology, and I'm really excited about this. I have here Kate Minniti. Did I Minniti? Yeah.
Yes, yes.
Kate Minniti, who's currently working on her PhD in Ancient Mediterranean and Near Eastern Studies at the University of British Columbia. Hello, Kate, and welcome.
Hello, Michael. Thank you for having me. And hello, everyone.
Yeah. Kate, how about you start us off? One of the questions my students are always interested in hearing about is kind of like what got you here? Was ancient history always something you were interested in? Did you kind of come about it later in life? What does that look like?
Um, okay. Oof. I'll try to keep it short. I was a huge book nerd when I was a child, like a bookworm. I would read everything. One of the first books that I remember reading was about Greek mythology.
Hmm.
So I'm sure that that's what started it. And then the big hook into it was a book on like architectural marvels of antiquity that my parents bought for me. I saw the pyramids, I saw the Parthenon, and I was like,
Wow.
done. That's what I want to do. And then Age of Empires happened.
Yes.
The first Age of Empires, with the 8-bit music. Um, so I was like, I had an inkling that that was something I wanted to do. I studied in a liceo in Italy, which is a high school in which you study mostly humanities with the addition of Greek and Latin. And then from there, I went into a BA in archaeology, and then two MAs in archaeology. And now I'm finally ready to finish this academic, portion of my life,
Mm.
and hopefully finish with my PhD at the end of this year. Um, and I've gone from straight up anything goes because my BA was not very focused
Mm.
to Egyptian archaeology to art history and archaeology of the Mediterranean to what started as a PhD in classics, which
Mm.
is classical archaeology, but now is more like Mediterranean archaeology. So I'm a jack of all trades.
Gotcha. Awesome. So, tell us a little bit about what your focus is. So you mentioned you have two MAs. What was each of the focus for each one of those?
So the first MA was at University College London at UCL, and it was on Egyptian archaeology. And it was a very object based degree, which is what I really liked. We would have classes in the Petrie Museum of Egyptian Archaeology. You would handle objects with care,
Mm.
and gloves, and a professor there, and a curator there. Um, and then we were also taught something that we were not taught during my BA, which is theoretical approaches to archaeology. But it was mostly object based and archaeology based rather than ancient languages. The second MA, which I did at the Institute of Fine Arts at NYU, was more art historical, but
Mm.
somehow I still managed to take more archaeological classes than art history because you kind of have to build your own route, and if the department approves, then that's what you can do. And the first, both of them, my dissertations, my thesis were on cross-cultural interactions in the Mediterranean, and both of them had to do with Greece and Egypt. So when I got to apply to PhDs, I was strongly motivated to keep doing that. And I found the perfect locus completely by chance in archaic Sicily, because during my MA at NYU, I became part of the archaeological expedition to Selinunte, which is in Sicily.
Mm.
Um, and I'm still digging with them. I mean, I should have gone this year, but bureaucracy didn't allow. But hopefully, I'll be there next year again. Um, and while we were there, I saw in many many museums Egyptian objects,
Mm.
and I asked myself, what is about? Why are there Egyptian objects in these museums in Sicily? And why are most of these from archaic context, right? Which is not exactly where you would think that there was like a strong connection between Sicily and Egypt. And then we found some in the temple in which we were working in Selinunte. So the
Oh.
plot thickens. So now the focus of my dissertation is precisely, Egyptian and Egyptian looking, Egyptian inspired, some issues with terminology there, in Sicily from the 8th century to the very early 5th century BC. So I took the long way around, but I finally come to the focus of my work.
Gotcha. So this might sound like a little bit of an odd question, but I would like for you to tell us a little bit more kind of what the difference is, because when I talk with my students and when I teach history, of course, it's a reflection on the sort of history that I'm used to doing, which is more like intellectual history of the modern period, right? And that is very, very different from more archaeological / object-based history. So can you tell us a little bit more about that? Like what's, I guess, maybe what the difference is between archaeology and history? How do you use archaeological objects to inform your view of the past? Let's start there.
Oh my God, that's a big question. I just finished writing my dissertation and now I'm here answering questions about that. So archaeology is now I'm gonna get the ires of everyone. It's the study of the past through the material culture, essentially. We try to reconstruct what was happening in the past from what we find. So ideally, in the ideal world, you would not go into it with preconceived ideas and notions of what you would find, but it's the other way around. Like, you find things, you interpret them, and then you reconstruct the context. So for instance, if you find, like if we found in some cases, a hole full of objects that are broken, the first question that you have to ask yourself is, when was this made? And why are these objects in there? And then you can ask, who made these and when, because it's in context, right? It is a very, in the best of possible scenarios, you would have strong chronological markers, so you know when things are happening. And then the more you look into them and the more you look at the larger context in which you're finding things, because things are in other, in larger contexts, they're not like in a bubble, in a vacuum. Then you start to understand the whys and the hows and the larger ideas. So for instance, in the case of our pit, there were objects that were clearly coming from the nearby temple, and they were broken. And the idea that we had at the beginning was that perhaps there was what we call a secondary deposition, or a rubbish pit, but sacred, which is what happens when temples have too many offerings. You need to put them somewhere. You cannot throw them away because those objects are sacred, but you cannot keep them in the temple because otherwise it's going to explode. So you dig a sacred pit in which you put these objects. We don't know with how much care, because some of them were really, really smashed, and then you cover it. So it's on sacred ground, so your bases are covered. They cannot be used anymore because they've been broken, so no one can steal them, and they're still next to the temple. So this is to say that, like, in archaeology, when you find things, you start looking at the things, and then you can open up more your field of vision, rather than going in with a big idea and then laser focus, because that leads to a lot of issues in which you misinterpret what you're finding, because you're already thinking about how you're going to interpret the things that you find without knowing what is it that you are going to find. That's a very,
Gotcha.
But it does
great.
happen.
Right. Yeah, no, that's awesome. So what is, so for example, as a history instructor, I'm oftentimes required, and I don't like it because I feel like so ill-equipped to actually do this, but I'm oftentimes required to teach like introductory level, like ancient history, even though what I do is modern history,
It's
right?
really not. Oh yeah.
Yeah. I'm sure
Yikes.
you understand, right? And so I think it's, if you could elaborate a bit more. So when I teach ancient history, it's like ancient Greece, ancient Egypt, ancient China, ancient India, and it's oftentimes presented not intentionally by myself, but as being like separate, distinct cultures. So what is the upshot, how do we interpret the significance of finding Egyptian artifacts or Egyptian influenced artifacts outside of Egypt? Like, what does that tell us about ancient Egypt or about the past? Or
Right. So, well, that is exactly what my dissertation is about, because there are a few ways in which you can interpret artifacts, and this like is not just like my dissertation. This is generally how archaeology works. You need a framework to interpret the objects. So, a framework is like a set of tools that you can use to interpret the objects. You find them and you ask yourself, why? Right? Why are they here? So, in the case of objects that seem vastly different from what would you expect to find there, the first question that comes to mind is, how did they come here? They did not sprout wings and come here. They did not walk here, right? They don't have little feet and they can walk. I mean, some have feet, but they can't walk. So who brought them here? So one of the first things that you can look at is trading networks, right? If these objects are here, then they must have come from somewhere. Did they come from Egypt? Did they come from other places that made these objects, right? So, and then you can start opening up, but also like focusing more. So if you want to open up, you can start look at other places in which similar objects have been found and other places that are not Egypt, and see if we know a little more about those contexts, right? For instance, southern Italy, Greece, Etruria, which is in central Italy, Crete, which is ostensibly not Egypt, it's closer, but or Western Asia, right? In Lebanon, in Turkey, you can have some of these objects. And then you can see if the conclusions that have been made for those places can apply to what you find in your own site. On the other hand, you can do the opposite deduction and ask yourself, okay, so these objects arrived, but like who bought them? Who is using them, right? And when you look at who is using them, and you look at who is using them not only in one site, but in more, then you can start seeing patterns. Like, for instance, if everyone who's using them seems to be very wealthy, then there may be something there. If everyone who is using them seems to be, let's say, this is not the case, but it could be a woman rather than a man, then there could be something there. If the variations in who and how is using them throughout the centuries are kind of consistent for every site, then you start having larger patterns. And then you can start looking at larger patterns from other regions and see if maybe something similar was happening. And then you turn to history and more archaeology to see what was it that was happening that would make people from vastly different regions of the Mediterranean all try to use the same objects or want to use the same objects. Because if something is there and something is imported for 3 centuries, it means there's a market for it. So there has to be a reason why people are choosing to import this stuff and buying it and using it. And another question that you can ask, and a thing that is really helpful, is do these objects appear with other types of material culture? For instance, Greek drinking vessels. And the answer is a resounding yes in most cases. So do they come on the same ships, or are they used for similar reasons? And if the answer is they may be used for similar reasons, then you must look at sociology and anthropology to understand why. And once again, open up and look at other regions to see if this was happening there, and maybe we have more information. And then we can infer that perhaps the same thing that was happening, let's say, in Greece was happening in Sicily at the same time. And then you can make it even bigger and say, okay, so what does this tell us about how society was evolving? Because if it's only a subset of society that is using these objects, clearly they are relevant. So we need to figure out, it's a sort of deductive process. It's Sherlock Holmes, it's Agatha Christie, it's Poirot, it's all of it, and a lot of dirt.
That's a fantastic way to describe it. Yeah. You made it sound very intriguing.
I try.
So, and this is an example of some. This is kind of what your PhD is focused on, correct? So,
Mhm.
you mentioned this Italian site that you're actively working on, and the finding of Egyptian artifacts there. Can you maybe go into that a little bit more and maybe give us a concrete example or two of kind of that the theoretical apparatus you just laid out for us?
Yes. So I actually can do that better from other sites than not ours,
Okay.
because our site is one temple.
Mhm.
It is a whole city, but the necropolis are a bit of an issue. But for instance, if we look at other cities like Syracuse, which is the biggest Greek city in Sicily during the Archaic and Classical period, it's the southeast. So we have a lot of scarabs,
Mm.
Egyptian scarabs, and vessels. There are probably perfume vessels, so they would, or like ointment or some sort of precious substances um, that are found not only in tombs but also in temples. So when you find some of these objects in temples, you can start looking at the whole assemblage of other objects with which they are found and ask, first of all, who's the god or goddess, right?
Mhm.
To whom are they offering these things? And then you can get into the why are they offering these things, right? Um, and then you have to look at the rest of the city, because it's like, are they only offering it in temple, or are they also using them like in everyday life stuff? And
Mm.
that's when you look at the tombs. And when you look at the tombs, you have people wearing these scarabs on finger rings, but also around their necks,
Okay.
on strings that we don't have. But when you find the bodies, the scarab is still there, right?
Mm.
The string is gone, but the scarab is still there. Or you find the bones and the rings are still there. So then you start asking, so let's look at all these people in this city. Let's look at first of all, let's look at how many tombs have these objects, right? On
Yeah.
the total of all the tombs, to see if this is a very common phenomenon or if it's just a small subset of people. And then among the people that you have, you start looking at grave goods and say, were these people rich?
Mm.
What was the gender that we assigned to these people? Although many times that is a problem, because if we don't have the bones, we need to base the assignment of the gender and biological sex to previous excavations, but sometimes you can never be sure, right? So
Yeah.
big question marks there. Um, and then you start looking at how they're used, and you start seeing that there are children in
Mm.
the mix, and there are women and children and certain types of vessels. This is mostly Megara, but also in Syracuse, um, are only for children or women that are buried with their children. So you can start asking yourself, why this type of vessel in this type of tombs? Were they for protection, maybe? And then, for instance, some of these vessels are in the shape of hedgehogs. And we know that in ancient Egypt, the hedgehog had a solar value because it's an animal that kind of goes into hibernation and then comes out.
Mm.
So maybe it was because somehow they had gotten wind that this animal had something to do with rebirth. Or
Oh.
maybe not. Maybe they were just, oh, these are tiny and cute, and children are tiny or cute. And so we can put them there, right? Because sometimes archaeologists tend to make these big, beautiful
Mm.
assumptions, and that the reality is like, nah, it's just shiny. They just put it there because it's shiny, right? But but then from there, you start making assumptions, and then you start looking at like how the city is evolving, like how the society in the city is evolving. Um, and so, for instance, you see that in the 7th century BCE, there are more tombs that start to seem wealthy, but they
Mm.
have a specific set of objects that they are using. So you have the drinking vessels, you have weapons, if you must, you
Mm.
have the Egyptian stuff, and you have other imports. So then you start looking at around Sicily to see if other tombs at the same time have the same characteristics. And then you start looking around the Mediterranean. And
Mm.
then you see, are all these people that seem to be wealthy and well connected using the same set of objects? Why is that? Right? why are they doing that? And that has to be, and this is one of the theoretical frameworks that we can use, is that of an international community of elite people that are all signaling to each other that they are part of this club by using the same objects, right? And the way that sometimes these objects are misinterpreted is that you find them in tombs, but they are not for the dead. They are of the living, and then you are buried with them. So you would showcase them if there's like a public event. You would wear your shiny rings. You would wear, you would be bedazzled in things. You would pull out your fancy drinking cups to drink from because you imported them. So you would signal to your own community, but also to other wealthy people that you were part of that club, right? And the fact that these objects are not expensive per se means that the value is not the price. It's not how much you spend for the objects, but it's the fact that you own the object that gives you prestige, right? It's not a one-on-one, it's expensive, it's prestigious. It needs to be the right kind of prestigious. Even if it's made of faience, which is, it's not even a stone, it's a paste, it's a glass paste. So it's, and then you need to get more into like more anthropological and sociological questions of, is this a product of society becoming more hierarchical? Are these people trying to buy their place into like the elite by showing that they can, they are well connected with other people, and they're trying to put themselves out there by saying, look, I can afford these things that my friends from across the sea have gifted me. Therefore, I'm one of them. So I'm also signaling to people from, I don't know, the neighboring city or the other rich families in my own city that I am part of this club, right? But there needs to be an understanding that these things are accepted in your own community first. And because if I start showing off stuff that my own community looks at and says, so what? That doesn't work. That doesn't give me prestige. So there needs to be a common language. The problem is that all these people are dead, and we have no written sources. So this is one of the best hypotheses right now, one of the best frameworks right now. And it is what some scholars call glocalization. So if we assume that the ancient Mediterranean was globalized in the sense that there were common trends with local responses, then by looking at how people in different places were responding to these trends, we can better understand their choices, because they have to kind of put themselves in between a great international, context again, but also their own communities. So they're trying to, it's some fine tuning between, I want to show off to my friends overseas, but also want to be recognized in my own community. But also I need to have the right kind of stuff to obtain prestige, right? That was a lot. But yeah, I could talk about this for hours.
No, that's super fascinating. So, and you might hate this, and if this is a stupid example, you just tell me it's a stupid example. But I was thinking of, like, what would be the modern equivalent of this to kind of like drive the point home?
I want to say a Rolex watch. I really want to say a Rolex watch, but actually, and if Brianna watches this interview, she's going to laugh. I think that French bulldogs and pugs are better. Okay, hear me out. So with scarabs, let's say scarabs and other things, there is a decline in quality, and probably a decline in price when mass factories open in the 6th century BC, which means that more people want these objects, right? The reason why they want them is probably because they had been status symbol. So people who are not part of the elite are trying to emulate the lifestyle by buying the status symbol, right? A small scarab might be cheaper than like a giant drinking pot, so you can get that. but the quality declines. However, the elites are still getting the cool stuff. Now put that into dog breeds, right? See what I'm saying? Like the rich can still get dogs that have, especially French bulldogs and pugs or retro pugs, that have not been bred to be, unfortunately for them, absolutely unusable, right? And suffering, because that's animal cruelty. But nowadays, like every white person in my Boston neighborhood can have a French bulldog, which tells me that it's kind of a gentrified neighborhood, but it's not a rich neighborhood, because now if you're rich, you either get the good ones or you get a Shiba Inu. Does it make sense? Does it bring the point across?
Gotcha. Yeah, I was thinking, I mean, what immediately comes to mind for me would be like fashion, right? So when I was in, I'm from the United States. So when I was in middle school and high school, it was very important, like what name brand clothes you wore.
Oh yeah.
And how you wore them. But I grew up really poor, so I always got the like later generation stuff. But I still thought it was cool because it was Nike and Tommy Hilfiger and all this other stuff. But the rich people were wearing like more. Is that kind of what we're talking about here?
Yes, indeed. It's the same, right? There is a term for that. I don't remember now. It's like a chain of using things. The rich people start using something, and then the lower classes, let's say classes, but it's an anachronism, but let's say classes, start imitating that, which means that there's a demand for imitations and cheaper knockoffs, let's say, of the fancy things, but the rich can still get the top-notch stuff. And the poorer people are trying to emulate what they're seeing in terms of material culture, but they can't afford the top-notch stuff, so they get the imitations. Right? That works for fashion, works for scarabs, works for dogs. It's very interesting to see. This is also like fairly evident in pottery, for instance. I'm not a pot person, but I am told that that is a thing that happens. But yeah, so yes, it starts as like status symbol, and then it becomes more common. But then again, is it just because it's cool? Or in the case of my objects, is it also because these things are considered amulets? Because in the 6th century BCE, we have some very poor tombs of children that have, like, for instance, there's one in Palermo that has 2 objects. One is a broken pot, and one is one of these amulets. So it means that those parents chose what to put in there, and one of those 2 things was an amulet, which means that they said, if I have to send my child to the afterworld with something, this has to be it, right? And we see this time and time again, that they are in the tombs of like women and children, because they are the weakest members of society. They're at risk. Therefore, you want to give them a protection. So it's like get you an object that can do both, right? It can be a status symbol, but it's also in popular religion an amulet, and you don't even need to be able to read the hieroglyphs on it, and it doesn't even need to come from Egypt. But the fact that you have it, it's like an assurance that maybe you'll be protected, or your child or your wife will be protected in the afterlife, right?
So a couple of questions here, and then eventually I do want to ask you about video games, because that's probably what people. But you mentioned a couple of things. The first I wanted to ask you about, you said mass production that started in the 6th century. Now, when I think of the ancient world, and you say mass production, I'm thinking of like factories. So, like, what do you mean mass production happened in the 6th century?
Let's say, factories that make these objects in series and in very great amounts. Like and you can see we found the molds that they used to make these things. We know more or less where the factories were located in the Mediterranean, surely in the Egyptian Delta, in Rhodes as well. And you can trace the evolution of the types by walking backwards from like the latest things to the earliest prototypes that you can find. There are studies, especially by Virginia Webb, which are phenomenal about this. And you can see that like these objects evolve, like the iconography evolves, but also the techniques evolve. And once you get to the 6th century BCE, I think we can talk about mass production, because these objects are everywhere. They're made for the international market. They're just, made, sealed and shipped to the international market. They don't really keep them there. And they are made by Greeks. So there's some net, some business shenanigans there, because earlier in the scholarship, people assumed that it was the Phoenicians because these amulets are Oriental. But then again, all these factories are managed by Greeks. Some of them are in Egypt, but in cities that are very they have a very heavy Greek presence. So we don't know who like the masterminds behind this were. But we do know that the production was incredibly like consistent, and like they were really churning like amulets and statuettes, and you name it, we have it, and we will sell it to you at a discounted price if you buy the whole lot. Like it's
That's very modern, right? That's like, yeah, that's really surprising.
It's business. Right. You gotta, and I mean, vases pretty much the same, right? You start imitations, and then you have these beautiful terracotta vases that look like they're made of metal, but they're not, because they're cheaper, right? Not everyone can afford a crater made of bronze, but more people will be able to afford a crater made of terracotta that looks like bronze, right? So you need to find, and it's fantastic. Like, ancient economy is a mess, but it's also very fun to look at for short periods of time. Let's put it this way.
So the other thing I wanted to ask you about, and I'm trying to think of the best way to frame this. So we have these Egyptian scarabs that may have had some sort of, I guess what I'm interested here is a Greek or an Italian person walking around with an Egyptian like religious symbol. Like, would they have understood like what that meant, or was it just like a "hey, this looks cool" type thing?
I wish we could ask them. I really wish we could ask them, like, have a seance and pull out one of these women and ask her, "Listen, do you know what you're wearing?" So that's a big question, because you never know if let's say cultural and religious values are traveling with the objects.
Yeah.
My best guess would be, okay, layers to the questions. So the first layer is they would have understood that these objects came from a place that is Egypt that they thought was magical, right?
Okay.
Egypt was very respected. So even if these pieces, mind you, are not coming from Egypt, because some are coming from Rhodes, which is really, I mean, no offense, really not magical. Cue the Rhodians being angry now. I'm gonna be haunted by Rhodian ghosts. But let's say in theory, these pieces come from Egypt, right? Which is a magical place. So you have these otherness projected on these objects. They come from a magical place. They have magical symbols on them, which you most probably cannot read. So they must be magical. There's a second layer to this, which is they are made to be worn, right? Because these scarabs are made to be worn with a chain or a string or anything around your neck, or on rings. So you're like, well, if they wear it like this, then probably I should also wear it like this. But the reason why an ancient Egyptian would wear a scarab is very similar, because they would wear them for protection. But that doesn't mean that they necessarily talk to each other about it. Like, I assume that like the merchants that had these things would probably market them when they arrived, but I don't know if they knew. But the thing that really makes me think that most of these people did not know how to use this stuff is when we look at the shabdis. So shabdis are funerary figurines that in ancient Egypt you have in your tomb with a magic formula on them. And they're supposed to answer in your place in the afterlife when you're called to do labor. There's a field to plow, there's water to be given to the plants, everything else. You sit there, your ushab, they do that. And the way they are connected to you is that your name is on them, right? There's a formula that says, I am the ushabdi of the deceased, blah, blah, blah. And when they are called, I will say, I am here. We have some ushabdis in Sicily. They don't have the names of the Greek owners. Some are stolen from Egyptian necropolis. Some don't have an inscription. Some have an inscription that is like copied but wrong. There's no name. So clearly, the idea that these were funerary objects had passed because they were in tombs, but they don't know how to use them because that's not how you use a ushabdi. Like, if I have your statuette in my tomb, it's not going to answer for me because that's not my name, right? So, so it may be that the general idea of these things worn around your neck are for protection, it may have passed. I have no issues believing that. These things are around my neck and they are protective because they represent the sun god that comes back to life every night. It's a step too far. But it's and as for like the rings, that's more that has more to do with, look how cool this golden and silver ring that I have with this, with this bezel, rather than this is magical, right? And for the vessels, it's probably more about what's inside than for the vessel itself. Although I have no issues believing that when they saw the little hedgehog vessels, they went bonkers. They were like, I must have this. I need this. I need all of this because they're so cute. But that's my guess.
Gotcha. That makes sense. So would this be an example? So I'll give you a personal example here. So my grandmother on my father's side was from Mexico. And she would, in her house, she had statues of Catholic saints, but she wasn't really Catholic, right? But she would she would give them offerings, like she'd pour out a little bit of tequila and, maybe like light a candle next to them. So it was clear that she didn't really have a full understanding of like what Catholicism was, but she did have some like Catholic cultural artifacts that meant something to her. So like religious synchronism, is that like kind of what we're seeing here? Like, would they just have said like, oh, that's a cute little sculpture, and kind of had a vague idea of what it was meant for? Or
that's a very difficult question, right? They might have had a vague idea of, like, especially for the amulets that you wear, that they were for protection. But I don't know how much, right? It's very difficult to say, oh, they are using objects from this other place, therefore they also know the cultural reasons that these objects are relevant in this other place. Okay. So they probably were doing like what your grandma was doing, in the sense that, oh, this is kind of like how I assume this is used, and like just to make sure I'm gonna wear it around my neck. But like it would be very difficult. Let me put it this way: it would be very difficult to demonstrate that they knew what they were doing 100%. And one of the things that they are not doing and that they are not importing is scarabs for the dead. There are specific heart scarabs with a specific formula, and they're big, they're chunky boys, that you could have in Egypt, and they would be made just for your tomb and put on your heart, because the formula on it is basically telling your heart not to snitch on you during the judgment. It's a very Mediterranean thing. But those are those are funerary, right? We know that in Egypt, the people who could not have those would just have like a regular scarab on their heart. But in Sicily, we do not find scarabs that were just like, we don't have heart scarabs. And we don't have scarabs that were just put there without like probably a string, without the hole in them. So I don't think they had like the full picture of what a scarab would do. But maybe they had like a vague, somehow a vague idea of this is a protection. Also, like, it's not just scarabs, it's also like figurines of gods. I don't think they knew the gods, But maybe they
Okay.
had a vague idea, oh, this is like a snake with a crown. Seems protective to me. I'm going to wear it, right? Or like, oh, this is the figurine of a person who's playing music. It seems cool to me. Let me offer it to this goddess for whom we play music, right?
Okay.
Something of the sort. Someone has suggested that these things are offered more often to female deities because they thought that they were fancy, therefore feminine. This could also be the fact that in Sicily there are a lot more big temples of female deities, especially a lot of temples to Demeter. A lot of like the divinities of the cities like the main ones tend to be female. It's a whole mess. I mean, we would need to dig everywhere and see if there's more, but like there is something there. But as for the passing of cultural values, yes and no, right? Kind of, but not completely. But it worked.
Huh. And I know you can't like give me a like super solid answer on this, but I love history of religion. I love history of religion, and I know a little bit about ancient Egyptian religion, and a little bit about ancient Greek religion and ancient Roman religion. So I'm curious. It's my understanding, and you can correct me and elaborate on this, but so the Greeks and the Egyptians seem to have had a very fluid understanding of religion, in the sense that maybe if I'm an ancient Greek person and I encounter a foreign deity, like that wouldn't really present the same sort of like cognitive dissonance as it would for like a Jewish person, right? Because of the strict like monotheism. We don't really have that. And so in ancient Greece or in ancient Egypt, so would it, I guess what I'm asking is, like, for the Greek person who finds the little statue of the Egyptian deity, can we assume that they would have just said like, oh yeah, I could just incorporate this into my current religious practices, or would it still be considered like exotic?
I mean, that is a really good question. If this was not the archaic period, if this was like the classical period, I would say this is like the Greeks trying to retcon themselves into Egyptian religion, because that's what Herodotus does. Like he says that the Greek religion comes from Egypt because Egypt is so much cooler, then we also must come from there, right? Because we are also cool. In the archaic period, there is a big question as to where, especially earlier on, the Greek, like the, how do I say it? Like the characteristics of the Greek deities and their names are so congealed already, right? Because some of these early places of worship have a lot of many things, and the cult is not like, oh, this is Demeter and this is Athena and this is Artemis, right? You can have, oh, this is a goddess who has loom weights, antlers, and weapons.
Okay.
Right? Is this like an early form of, let's say, Demeter or Artemis? Is this like a goddess that later on becomes identified with, a Greek goddess? But I don't think that like in the archaic period they would have had very strict parameters for like which gods are ours and which gods are like we can't really deal with.
Okay.
Also, I mean, the figurines of the gods, this is interesting because the figurines of the gods are usually more used by the Phoenicians than the Greeks. And the Phoenicians had been using Egyptian amulets since at least the 10th century BCE.
Oh, wow.
So
Okay.
they knew these gods. They knew these deities, right? So I don't think that for a Phoenician living in Sicily, using a lion-headed goddess would have been that weird, because maybe grandma in Sidon or Tyre had the same statuette, on her shelf, right? That's also the question of like who is using which types of objects. And the amulets in the shape of gods are like usually later and mostly in Phoenician context. The Greeks were very particular about using a lot of scarabs and a lot of vessels.
Okay.
But figurines, unless they were figurines of animals or full humans, not the weird animal-headed ones. But I don't know if it's because they did not appeal to them, or maybe the traders that were going there did not carry that stuff. Because like we don't know if they didn't want them because they didn't like them, or if they didn't have them because the traders were not bringing them, right? So
Gotcha.
it is a difficult answer to give. Once again, I wish we could pull them, pull them out of the realm of the dead and ask them things, but we can't for now.
Gotcha. No, I appreciate that answer. That's yeah, really. I'm already learning so much. All right, so let's talk the representation of the ancient world in contemporary media.
Right. So from weird amulets to monsters, I think that's a perfect
Yes,
segue.
it was make the jump, right? Yeah, I did want to ask you about monsters because this is what I put in the promo for this talk. So, what Egyptian monsters, I guess, have caught your attention? And let's talk about representation in media. How are
Ooh.
Egyptian monsters represented in media?
Okay, so when I talk about Egyptian monsters, I have to make the premise that my screen name online is the name of the Eater of Souls, Amit. Like I am Amit on every social media gaming platform apart from Xbox, like Twitch, Discord, everything else. Because she's so cool. She's the tree, the monster made of the three animals that the Egyptians were most afraid of. She has the jaws of the crocodile, the mane and the front paws of the lion, and then the butt and the leg, the back paws, the back legs of a hippo. So she's like, as deadly as you can get. Not a goddess, with sorry, Moon Knight, but not a goddess. She's just an employee. She's a good girl, and she eats and annihilates the unworthy. So that was like that's my favorite of the monsters. Unfortunately, until very recently, she hasn't been very present in pop culture, right? When you think about ancient Egyptian monsters, you have mummies. As always, like I mean, since 1932,
Right.
that beautiful movie with Boris Karloff, um, was a lot. And then you have Anubis, or like Anubis light
Yeah.
kind of monsters. And you have like all sort of anthropomorphic animals, like animal-headed figures. Sometimes you got the cat-headed, sometimes you got the crocodile-headed, sometimes you have crocodiles, like full stop. Which kind of makes sense, but not really monsters in and of itself. And then you have a lot of, and this is Orientalism 101, ancient priests performing black magic.
Yeah,
Right?
yeah.
Do they count as monsters? I think they kind of do, because it's it's very Orientalistic. It's like, oh, they can bring back the dead. That's like, an Egyptian would never. But we see like a range of things that actually have some precedent in Egyptian iconography, to things that where did they get them from. So you got, for instance, in like games like Age of Mythology, you have flying cobras. Perfect, that's iconographically sound. You have, and Herodotus tells us that there are flying serpents, so we trust him. And then you have giant scorpions and giant scarabs, which are technically not monsters for the Egyptians because those are divine things. And then you have the crocodiles with the laser in their head, which is fun. And then on the other side, you have Anubis, like Anubis himself, as like a playable character, like in Smite. And he's like, Anubis is the poster boy of Egyptian monsters, right? In media, in pop culture, it's always him. And this is so, like, it's fascinating to me that we as a society, like we as Westerners, are okay with taking a god that is essentially like a good guy and just making him into the poster boy of the monsters, right? it is weird. There's something weird there, and we do not take the actual things that the Egyptians would consider monstrous, which are, for instance, hippos, or the eater of souls, and or Set, who is, but he's not evil, but he's like, he has questionable morals. Let's put it this way. And we instead choose to use this hodgepodge of weird things. So, or giant snakes. Snakes are always good, right? There's always, you can never go wrong with a giant snake, but it's like, it's kind of, there's a lot of Orientalism there and a lot of repeating tropes, right? It's almost as if, oh, this is ancient Egypt. So this is like the Platonic idea of ancient Egypt in the world of ideas. What do we need? Well, camels, cats, pyramids, palm trees, and a guy with the head of a jackal. That's it. That's ancient Egypt, right?
Gotcha.
So
let's get your personal best of and worst of. Where and you can choose which one you want to start with, but where have you seen Egyptian monsters represented well, and where have you seen them represented poorly?
Okay, so let's start from bad. Okay. So I've been playing Forewarned with a bunch of other archaeologists because it's a game that has to do with archaeology and being trapped in a tomb and everything else. And the evil, the villain is a mummy. And I was like, I have issues with, like, I mean, I understand that it's a horror trope. It's a very fun game, like, highly recommend. But like, I have issues with reconciling the fact that we as Western Europeans and North Americans have issues, like, want to make human remains into something that is monstrous since back in the days, where like an Egyptian would not be worried about a physical body hunted them, right? They would be worried about their ghost being angry, but not a mummified body, because that was part of life somehow, right? And I also have to mention Age of Mythology because of those wacky laser crocodiles. I love them, but they're wacky. That's a burning mirror, like one of Archimedes' mirrors, like smack on their heads, which is a great way. Like, I love them, but I can't give them that. I can't give it to them. Good monsters. Oh my god! So there is this very old game called Egypt 3, The Fate of Ramses, in which you play as a female Egyptian doctor and dream interpreter, who has to, of course, defeat a curse, because it's always Egypt. So yes, you have the pyramids, the palm trees, the cats, but you're like, and in one of the sequences, in which is not really explained if she's having visions or if this is happening for real, she has to go in the afterlife to pass through a gate for reasons. And there are gates taken from the Book of the Gates, which is 100% like an Egyptian text, with the guardians of the gates that are perfect. So the guardians of the gates are usually like monsters, like monstrous creatures that have like the body of humans, and they're wearing white linen clothes, but their heads can be everything from a whole scarab to 3 serpents to a bird to a lion, and they have a knife. They're fantastic. They're perfect. And the way that you pass through the gates, which is the thing that really sent me, is not that you have to fight them, because you can't fight them. They're demons and guardians. You need to answer their questions, which is how you pass through the gates in Egyptian mythology. And I was like, someone did their homework. This is fantastic. This is incredible. So I love that. I also did like in Assassin's Creed Origins, when you have to fight the giant Apep snake with a bow that is made of sunlight, because that is very, I mean, it's kind of a very dramatic interpretation, but I like that. And I like that the snake goes actually into the water and then out of it, because the boat of the sun god is actually sailing through the water. when the snake attacked. So that's fantastic.
Mm.
But I think that like Egypt 3 and the Guardians really, really, really sent me. I was like, yes, this is fantastic. And it's difficult because these questions are like, what is the name of this gate, and what is the name of the guardian, and what is the name of the ore, which is like I understand that like I sound like a giant nerd, but that was amazing.
No, that's awesome. So a few questions here, and so let me ask you about mummies first. What I was about to say, what's the deal with mummies? Like, this is
I don't know, they dead.
I've never understood this either. Like, and it might just be because I need to do some like American pop culture history to understand like where the trope of the mummy comes from. But can you explain a little more about like how wrong that is from an Egyptian perspective?
So I can explain how wrong that is from an Egyptian perspective, and then from like an Egyptological and museum perspective too.
Yeah.
So from an Egyptian perspective, your body needs to be preserved, not because of vanity, but because your body is one of the 5 parts that make you you. So your body needs to be preserved, your name needs to be preserved, and that's like the bare minimum. And then your spirit, and then your other parts are like your magic and your other spirits. It's a mess. So the reason why they would mummify people, and that is also like the big debate of, does it count as mummification if you're just put in a smaller tomb with a shroud, but not really mummified, but the desert is mummifying you and preserving you? And I would say yes, because the point is that the body needs to be preserved. So for an Egyptian, a preserved body would not be anything scandalous, right? It would be much worse if the body was destroyed, or if the body was still mummified but without a name, which is what they did to enemies in high places. Like, for instance, we have several mummies that were buried with nothing with their names on and sheepskins on them. And it has been suggested that these were like high society people that had been participating in a plot to kill Pharaoh. And they had been condemned to... So they had been strongly suggested to commit suicide or executed. And then they had been buried without their name and without like their proper assemblage that they would need for the afterlife, so that they could not pass the judgment and they would be annihilated. But still, their bodies preserved, right? Because you destroying someone's body is so unthinkable. It's so wrong. Even if it's your worst, if it's your worst enemy, you may consider. But if it's someone in your family, if it's someone who's Egyptian, you usually destroy their name. Like we know that, for instance, in one of the sarcophagi, there were probably Akhenaten sarcophagi. The name has been chipped away. His face, like the face of the mask, has been, cut away, but the body is still there. Very poor condition. Because but that's also the problem with like looting tombs, because mummies would have amulets all like in all the various layers of bandages, and if you pull, the bandages are attached to the matter, to the organic matter, and so you pull and everything comes away. It went really gory. But anyway, so Egyptians would probably not have been scared of like a mummy in and of itself. They would have probably been more scared of not having a mummy walking around. They would have been afraid of ghosts. That we know.
Gotcha.
Angry, vengeful spirits, they would have been terrified about. From a museum perspective, there's the problem is that using mummies as a cheap scare is morally and ethically wrong, because you start treating people as objects, right? You start treating them as this is a prop, which is, it's not fair. Like the fact that we're already like showcasing these bodies of people, even if they are in their sarcophagi and with their names, but still showing like parts of them, I think it's very disrespectful. I wouldn't want that to happen to me. Yeah. I wouldn't appreciate that. But I understand that like this is a very very white, very European thing, but it's not universal. But there is a debate in Egyptology about whether we should, in museums, we should display these bodies, because there is something to be said about giving dignity to someone else's body, especially if this someone else's culture and like group is not there to ask, right? Or to say,
Yeah.
yes, that is okay, no, that is not okay, right? We're kind of deciding for them to showcase them as objects, but there is a case to be made for the fact that that is dehumanizing, I think. Which is also why I have beef with using mummies as monsters. Like, Jesus, they have like fantastic creatures. Use something weird. Like, amaze me. Don't use a mummy. Use something better. You know, open a book and find something cooler.
No, that makes sense. Yeah. The second thing I wanted to ask you about with respect to Egyptian monsters, and again, I'm not sure if this question will make much sense, but if you look at like monsters that I was about to say, so American culture is largely based off of European culture and has its kind of roots in the Judeo-Christian tradition. And so, like something like a snake is scary because of its association, like with the first couple chapters of the Book of Genesis, right? And the snake is associated with Satan and with evil, and that's why we find snakes. And of course, like snakes bite you, right? And
Well,
can
yeah.
kill you. So
They get angry.
that's why we find it like one reason why we might find it scary. And maybe and use as much creative leeway as you want to here, but I'm wondering about the like what is psychologically, to psychoanalyze ancient Egyptians a little bit, what would be scary about like Amet, the configuration of the different animals?
That is like a very practical answer to that. So the Egyptians were scared of things that could kill you. So we have chapters. I think it's the Book of Coming Forth by Day, on how to repel snakes, how to not be bit by scorpions, how to not be eaten by crocodiles, right? Amet is the quintessential monster because it is made of the three worst animals that they had there. Because crocodiles are terrifying. Like, they're I love them. They're really cool. I wouldn't go near one and ever again. I've been not a fan.
Been near one.
I've been not a fan.
Wow.
Yeah, a small one. But he was spicy. And they being eaten by a crocodile deprives you of pieces of your body. And if you fall into the Nile and a crocodile snatches you, there's no guarantee that your body will come up, right? And that's a problem. So much so that the Egyptians had to think about a way of like making this good, because it's not really your fault if you drown or you're eaten by a crocodile. But if your body is not preserved, then that's a problem, right? So that's an issue of like body preservation is there. Lions are big angry cats, and also they were hunted by elite Egyptians. Crocodiles too. They were hunted for sports, but of course it is wow, we're getting into the masculinity thing. It is a feat of strength, that proves that you are like a manly man if you can kill something that is actually made to kill you, right? That can easily kill you. And also, the lion is a solar animal, so like it has all the strength of the sun god, especially the lionesses, because the goddess of slaughter is a lioness, and she is the daughter of Ra, and she actually is the eye of Ra. So when the sun god Ra wants to destroy all of humanity, he sends his daughter in the shape of the angry lioness, and she destroys humanity. So a lion is pretty scary. Also, they have pretty long claws. So and hippos are the worst. I know that baby hippos are very cute. Cincinnati Zoo has a new one, and he's a peach of a baby. He's gonna grow up into a killer. Um, Hippos are vegetarian and they will kill you for sports. You cannot outrun a hippo. You cannot outswim a hippo. A hippo will squash you if it's in the wrong mood. Hippos are very violent, extremely dangerous, extremely moody. They have fangs, the tusks actually, that can smash. And Egyptians were terrified of hippos, and they were right to be. And the hippo is also one of the zoomorphic manifestations of the god Set. The god Set. Set is the god of many caveats here: god of chaos, god of the tempest, god of the desert. He is the main antagonist of Horus, who is basically Pharaoh, like the god of Pharaoh. And in many instances, when you see Set being defeated by Horus, it is Horus harpooning a hippo. So, and because they're like incredibly like moody, they're angry and they kill each other and they just bite. They don't even eat meat, but they just kill. So they're terrifying. So Egyptians were like very practically terrified of the three things that were the more lethal, and also the biggest probably, because snakes are lethal, right? You could say, but what about snakes and scorpions? Yes, but you have the best natural defense against snakes, which is cats. Right? And ichneumons, which are mongoose, and they eat snakes. They hunt them and they eat them, and then they lick their fingers. So it's like you got them, right? And those were also worshipped in ancient Egypt, right? I don't know if they tried to tame them. I can't see that going well for them. Ichneumons are spicy animals, but cats, they had them, right? And a scorpion, I mean, you can bludgeon a scorpion. It's okay, right? But like an angry scorpion or an angry hippo, oof. Yeah. Right, so it's a very practical demon. I'm sure there are more theological reasons for it, but like my sense is that the reasons are very practical. Like these things will kill you, and it's difficult to kill them and to defend yourself.
No, that makes a lot of sense. Yeah, I can see that. So to close this out, I want to ask you the question that I ask everyone that I have on here, which are some of your favorite book recommendations, video recommendations, and then, of course, some of your favorite video game recommendations.
Okay. Wow. So books recommendation. And this is also like a video game recommendation. I just finished playing Heaven's Vault, which is a great video game with one of the best representations of archaeology I can think of in games. I should premise this with I am one half of the team that does live Archeo gaming streams for the Save Ancient Studies Alliance. Maybe we can leave like links somewhere.
Yes.
And we're starting again next month. The last game that we played this year was Heaven's Vault. It is a great game. It's very nerdy. You have to translate ancient languages. You have to understand the past. And the game director has also written 2 books, which kind of expand on the game and like show you it's a very open-ended type of game. So I would say that like they kind of show you the canon way in which the story goes, but there's a but there because the story is a cycle. So you never know if the things that you're doing are the things that have already happened or that will have. It's a loop, right? And I could not put that book down. I couldn't. Like the other night, I was reading in bed. And I was like, oh, it's 10:30. I'm just gonna read a few pages, and then go to bed. And the next thing I know, it's 2 a.m. and I'm completely engrossed in the book. Yeah. So that is a book recommendation that I have. Books about games. There's Women in Classical Video Games that has just come out. Highly recommended. It's fantastic. It's great. And it is a collection of essays on female protagonists in games set in antiquity. It's fantastic. It's excellent. And we will have the authors as our guests for our first live stream with SASA. Yeah, in 2 weeks. So that is it. And then video recommendations. Oh my god, just go watch Brianna play.
Yeah.
It's we did a whole series on playing Curse of the Pharaohs, which is the wacky DLC of Assassin's Creed Origins. And it was hilarious because she didn't know what she was getting into. I did. The other person did not. It was incredible. It was fantastic. And it was like a lot of good commentary on like, oh, how historically accurate this is, and like how cool this is, and like I like this interpretation, and why didn't they put the baboon statues here? You know, let's set things on fire. So it's like, this is kind of a shameless plug, but yes, please go watch our SASA videos.
There's some really fun videos for sure. All right. Well, thank you, Katie, for joining me today. I'll put some links down in the description of this video. And yeah, I appreciate it. This was a lot of fun.
Thank you for having me. I hope that my big, theoretical archaeological introduction did not scare people away. But yeah, and if you want to talk about monsters and everything else, you can just find me like on social media. I will give you my my moniker on on Twitter, which is where I'm the most active. And I'm always happy to chat about like video games and monsters and my dissertation, but do that at your own risk.
Yes.